So, Bill 212. Let's talk about Bill 212 and what it does for road safety, or what it doesn't do. I write a column for the community every week in our newsletter, Speaker, and I described my experience in this House last week as going through a trip through the Twilight Zone. I don't know if anybody else in this House is a huge fan of that show, but I love that show. I think Rod Serling is one of the underrated geniuses of 20th century television. And he used satire, he used absurdism, he used surrealism, he used horror, he used suspense, often to bring social commentary to topical issues, not just in the United States, but around North America, you could argue around the world, although the Americans often think they can dictate to the world. So don't take me too far, I'm not a TV critic. My point is this. Last week was like a trip into the Twilight Zone. And why? Because the Premier had set the stage for this discussion on road safety we're having right now by ruminating about the idea of a tunnel under the 401. People remember that? So he was standing in front of the 401 that, yes, is jammed with traffic, and he was standing with ministers, and I got to say, it's a big part of my heart. I felt bad for those ministers, because there he is, bloviating about the idea of a tunnel under the 401. Like, just back of a napkin, I'm going to do an estimate about a back of the napkin plan for a tunnel under the 401. And it had to be embarrassing, Speaker, because, you know, the biggest tunnel that engineers know of in North American construction engineering history is the Big Dig in Boston. The Big Dig in Boston was literally, if depending upon the Premier's ambition for this, it might have been a quarter of what the Premier is proposing. So when people were trying to make sense of what he was figuring out, he was studying the feasibility of, they were talking about a $55 billion project that might be finished in 15 to 18 years, might, while people are stuck in traffic on the 401. You know, the thing about the 401 that's really problematic, Speaker, it's all the bike lanes on the 401. My God, if you guys would just remove the bike lanes off the 401, those poor drivers would just be able to get where they're going so much faster. I'm just trying to articulate a perspective from the Twilight Zone, Speaker, because that's really what the poor people of Ontario had to deal with. I mean, Rod Serling would have loved that speech the Premier gave. You know, the fact of the matter is this. We do have gridlock in our province. And the origin of that gridlock is not active transportation lanes. The origin of that gridlock is this government's failed transit plans. I can't recall another government in Canadian history that has done more press conferences talking about aspirational transit plans than this government. But meanwhile, the people who actually conduct the buses, that fix the buses, that conduct the streetcars, that fix the streetcars, the riders that rely on, I mean, your city here, Speaker, here in Toronto, I think it's 2.5 million users a day. That's a lot of people relying on public transit in the greater area of Toronto. But the mayor of Toronto had to literally strong-arm this government to get its own deal to get $330 million into the Toronto Transit Commission, because there's a formidable leader of this city. But in my city, Speaker, we're still waiting. We're still waiting in gridlock in our city because we have no new money to operate transit. It's so bad, Speaker, there's a story running in CBC today that of the trips that were scheduled for a given week last week, 8,210 planned daily trips, there were 340 of those canceled on Monday, 297 canceled on Tuesday, 270 of those canceled on Wednesday. And why? Because the government keeps cutting money to the operational funds of OC Transpo. And that is not just an Ottawa story, it's a London story, it's a Windsor story, it's a Sudbury story, it's a Peterborough story, it's a Brampton story. We have a government that loves to cut ribbons about aspirational transit plans that may happen at some point soon. But the actual buses and streetcars that we got are being shortchanged. And then guess what people do? Guess what students going to college or university do? Guess what people getting around the communities do? They take a car. Uber. They take an Uber. Yep. The last estimates that I know of for 401 usage is that about 85% of the users on a given day, just over 1 million users, are single passenger occupants of their car. I'm sure frustrated. But they're not going to be helped by the Twilight Zone ambitions of the Premier, that on the one hand is talking about this fantastic idea that must have been dreamt up over breakfast, and on the other hand, you got people who are actually stuck. So people are mad for being stuck, and they have a right to be mad for being stuck. But the Premier is plunging this House, this esteemed House, into a twilight zone, and frankly making a mockery of our democracy. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to answer questions from residents back home about a 401 tunnel. But I always say back to people who've texted or called or emailed, I said, you know, you have to remember the following about this Premier. It's not about actually doing something, rather like Mr. Trump has done in the United States. It's about saying something ridiculous so you get all of the attention, and we don't talk about serious ideas. We don't talk about serious ideas, like taking trucks off the 401 and putting them on the 407 and subsidizing that, or making sure public transit was regular and affordable so people could actually use it. These are the things. The One Fare movement was a win from the TTC riders. The Minister of Energy just mentioned this, and I salute the Toronto transit riders for winning that One Fare initiative. But you know what? It's difficult, Speaker, if someone is commuting from Scarborough into downtown Toronto to be waiting for their schedule, because this government continues, we're doing a little bit better in Toronto thanks to Mayor Chow, but continues to lowball the operating funds for public transit. That is the reason people are stuck in traffic. You know, it's interesting. In Etobicoke, there was a public meeting recently about this whole war on bike lanes. It was fascinating, Speaker, because the Premier, once again into the twilight zone, has been saying all the time, oh my God, one of the most dangerous things about these woke bike lanes is that first responders are being delayed in responding to accidents. Do you know what was interesting about that town hall, Speaker, hosted by the City Councillor Amber Morley, Deputy Mayor Amber Morley, was that the local fire chief took the stage and said, actually, our response times are faster with the active transport lane. Why? Because they've been built to a width that allow the paramedic bus or the police car to get through and to get to where they need to go quickly. The delay in response times in traffic, according to the city staff who provided the estimates, are about 5 minutes delayed going eastbound and 3 minutes delayed going westbound. So that's reality. That's not the twilight zone. That's reality. We are stuck in traffic out there because this government continues to underfund operating transit. They're addicted to press conferences, but they're not providing funds for transit. And they put a lot of faith in Phil Verster and his army of executives at Metrolinx. I have a joke for you, Speaker. Joke for the House. How many Metrolinx executives does it take to change a light bulb? Anybody know the answer? All of them. It's difficult to say, but my best guess is 103. 82 vice presidents, up from 27 6 years ago, 19 C-suite executives, and a premier willing to authorize the paychecks. But I guess we're assuming that those overpaid, overstuffed executives on the public dime are actually going to be able to change a light bulb. I mean, the last job Mr. Verster had before the Liberals hired him to run the public transit system of Metrolinx when they were in office here was Scottish Rail. And you know what was interesting? The people of Scotland chased Mr. Verster out of their country because they pressed for information. They found out Mr. Verster was making an incredible amount of money, north of $300,000 Canadian. They found he had a housing allowance. He had a personal car. He had a clothing allowance. He had private health care for himself and all his family. And Scottish people, I was raised in a Presbyterian household. Let me tell you, Scottish people don't put up with that nonsense. He was run out of Scotland in disgrace, and the Liberals hired him, and this government has kept him in power. Speaker, in what universe does a Conservative government reward someone who can't finish a transit project? The Eglinton Crosstown, the Huron-Ontario, the Ontario line, they keep talking about the tunneling for which being complete. As the transit critic for the province, I get to talk to transit experts from around the world. I got to tell you what they say when they look at Ontario. They think Ontario has become the most expensive place to build transit in the world. in the world because of the vultures of consultants, the tapeworms of all of these people, like consultants managing consultants in Metrolinx. You know the marketing department at Metrolinx on its own, Speaker, is more than 400 staff? A marketing department. So embarrassed Metrolinx executives approach us because they can't believe what they're seeing. But this conservative government that purports to care about the public purse keeps Mr. Verster in power. And while they do, traffic is delayed. But let's talk about the genius idea inside the Twilight Zone, Speaker, to wage a war on safe infrastructure and bike lanes. I want to quote the words that I cited earlier in debate from the Premier himself. Outside this very building in November 2017, he took a bike ride with the federal leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. It used to be on TVO's Blind Date episode. You used to be able to go find the episode. Curiously, you can't right now. However, people have managed to track it down. And the Premier was following. If people know, outside here at Queen's Park, there's protected bike infrastructure. But there's a moment when you merge onto University, when you have to take a bit of a risk, right? You go across the road, and you can see in the video, Speaker, there's a moment where the Premier kind of swerved into traffic a little bit and swerved back. He admitted that he hadn't been on a bike in a long time. And these were his words to the TVO camera crew when he was finished his ride with Jagmeet. Quote, "You're nervous when there's no bike lanes. At least I was. We have to do everything we can to make sure there's never a death in our city. One death is too many when it comes to bicycle riders." Wow. That's a very interesting perspective. Haven't actually gone into the experience of trying to ride a bike in a major city in our province. So what's behind the change of mind? What has plunged us into the Twilight Zone 7 years later? The best answer I've been able to give constituents back home, Speaker, is crass politics. This government is taking advantage of people's justifiable frustrations with traffic and gridlock and turning them not on viable solutions like public transit, encouraging trucks onto the 407. They're telling them to blame cyclists. They're telling them to blame wheelchair users. They're telling them to blame people who scooter. And that's, frankly, a shameful way to behave. It's a shameful way to behave. I honestly believe, I want to believe, that everybody in this House cares that people be able to get around their communities and get home safely at the end of the day. But what the Premier has done, by plunging us into a debate without any evidence, not a shred of proof, and I'll get into a couple little blurbs of proof he's attempted, I mean, he is actually putting people's lives at risk. If he's going to go into municipalities claiming he knows better than municipalities and remove safe infrastructure, he's going to be putting people's lives at risk. We've talked a lot about cyclists, Speaker, and they've been outspoken the last couple of weeks. I want to talk about pedestrians. In particular, I want to talk about seniors. I want to talk about my good friend here from St. Catharines and her mom, Pat Lindell, who is crossing a street in St. Catharines in front of an elementary school, this way, Speaker, and a car thought they could speed quickly and turn right in front of Pat. Well, they collided with Pat, almost a direct hit. She was knocked 50 feet into the opposite sidewalk, missed a fire hydrant by about a foot. She had a broken tibia, she had a broken clavicle, she had pins in her leg. The witnesses who saw this said she looked like a rag doll in the air. 7 months she was in hospital. 7 months. Was there any consequence for this reckless driver? Did the reckless driver have their license mandatorily suspended for a year? Were they required to witness a victim impact statement from Pat? No. I proposed such legislation before this House with Bill 40, but the government voted against that legislation. And they're ignoring Pat now. I'll think about others, because there are many others. I'll think about a 6-year-old who was killed in Tweed. A 6-year-old. I see the member for the area in this House today. A 6-year-old killed in Tweed on September 2nd. Will there be any mandatory driver's license suspension for that person who killed that 6-year-old in Tweed? Will there be any responsibility for that person to volunteer to become a better driver? No, not in this bill. I also learned about Charlotte Light, a 14-year-old killed on County Road number 2 in Long Sault, just outside Cornwall. I know the family. I know the family. So the member is saying, Speaker, in debate, that it's a highway, so therefore you can mow a cyclist down, I guess. That's the claim. But this cyclist, this 14-year-old beloved cyclist, Charlotte Light, oldest sibling in a family of 5. I know the family. I know the uncle, personal friend. Will there be any mandatory driver's re-education for the person who committed this incident? To their credit, they stayed at the scene. The answer is no, and this bill will not require that. Will there be any restorative justice? Pardon me? So the minister's joking. I'm not joking. I'm actually saying I proposed legislation before this House based on best practices elsewhere in the world that would say to someone who's committed a highly dangerous and reckless act with their car, commit yourself to being better. It's reasonable legislation. But the government voted it down. And I can tell you right now, this young woman is missed by her community, missed by her uncle, who's a personal friend of mine. Speaker, the number in the real world, outside the twilight zone, in the real world, Ministry of Transportation Ontario statistics tell us that last year, 49,106 incidents were caused by reckless drivers. People were either killed or seriously injured. That is a rate of 134 a day. And the members opposite have said, and I bet in questions will still say, we have the safest streets in the world. Well, if you're comfortable with the rate of 134 people being hurt or killed every day, then yes. But that means you're governing from the twilight zone. You're not governing in reality. I looked at governments in Finland. I looked at governments in Denmark who set the mark where my city has set it, Vision Zero. The goal is no one gets, Sweden has embraced the Vision 2. I take the member's point. No one gets hurt or killed on their way home. And it's not just cyclists, wheelchair users, pedestrians. It's road workers, construction workers. It's first responders. I've talked to police, paramedic, fire, who've recounted horrible incidents of reckless behavior behind the wheel. But as long as there's no criminal intent, there's no criminal consequence. There's no serious consequence, I should say, correcting my words just now. We know that driving should be seen as a privilege, regardless of what vehicle you drive. It's a privilege. It's not a right. But right now in Ontario, if you critically injure or kill someone with your car, it's a few $100s of a fine, and you hope you have a good day in court if you're trying to support justice for the aggrieved party. And that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable, and there's nothing in this legislation to change that. The Premier is causing a fight that is unnecessary. Unnecessary. I believe in the transportation departments of the municipalities of this province, the 440 municipalities who we entrust to ensure safety. I believe in the first responders that serve those communities. But I also know that all too often tragedies continue to happen. And I will not, as the critic for this area, I will not be happy with that. And I wish my friends opposite not to be happy with it either, because there are things we can work on together to fix it. A big thing I think we need to fix is getting to the front bench of this government and encouraging them to speak in reality and evidence and not from the perspective of the twilight zone. Quit besmirching a wonderful show. Sorry, I'll go for levity there. Here's my point as I wrap up, Speaker. Here's my point. I know increasingly people in this province want choice with how they get around our communities. I'm a driver, I'm a cyclist, I'm a pedestrian. People want to have that choice. But particularly when your children are involved, or when your mom or your dad, who may be frail, are involved, you want to make sure that there's a safe way in which they can get around. And when someone hurts or harms them, they want to make sure that those people are held accountable. So this is our opportunity. When this bill goes to committee, I will be coming with amendments, you better believe it, based upon good evidence to make sure that we do right by those folks. We do right by Charlotte. We do right by Serene Summers, who was critically injured in my city in 2022 by a driver who fled the scene. We do right by Audrey Kemen, who was hit as a pedestrian crossing Carling Avenue back in September, who's going to live with brain injuries for the rest of her life. There's just too much carnage happening in our street, and I'm disappointed, frankly, that the government isn't acknowledging that carnage. All All of these children of our province, they're all our children. All of the elders of our province, they're all our elders. The elders built everything we have here. Everything we have here, we got from our elders. So we need to make sure they don't end up like Pat. And that's on us. That's on us. So we need to fix this bill at committee, and I invite debate.